it doesn't perform, the patient dies. So you need to be certain that the device will perform reliably. Of course, there will be situations where, in extreme cases, the device may fail, but there isn't that's always going to be true. You can't completely eliminate the risk of failure, but you can minimize it, and that's what regulators expect of you, is that you have to minimize the risk of a device failing. So in general, a commercial medical device will be more reliable than something that you would throw together in a lab. And the third thing is cost. The last thing is cost. Cost, of course, is not of primary importance when you're trying to answer a research question. Like, you don't really care what it costs. Of course, you may have a grant, so you need to work within that. But ultimately, the cost is not your primary question. The primary question that you're trying to answer is a research question. So you don't really care about cost. But with regards to a commercial medical device, it has to turn a profit for the company. It sounds bad to say that, but at the end of the day, if you cannot sell a device and make a profit, the company won't survive. So at the end of the day, the device, the commercial medical device that you manufacture has to be something that is going to turn you a profit. So it has to be made in a cost-effective manner. At the same time, also ensuring that it is safe, it has a good build quality, it is usable, and that it is reliable. So this is not an easy task, of course, but you have to do it. So moving on, any questions so far? Okay. Sure. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about the objectives of product development. What are we really doing? Now, it's very important to realize that the product that you're developing, and this is not only true for medical devices, it's probably true for any device that you're developing, whether it's a consumer device or a medical device, is that it should solve a problem. It shouldn't be something that is cool, that you put together, through together in a lab, and then you try and find an application for it. You have to identify an issue, and in case of a medical device, a clinical problem that needs solving, and then you need to develop a device to solve it. You can't go the other way around. So I think that's a very important thing that we need to keep in mind. The first thing that you have to do in the process of a medical device development or product development in general is identify a problem and then try to solve that problem. The second very important thing is that the device should have clinical utility. Like, it should have some, like I said in my first point, it should solve a problem. The third thing is it should make a material difference to patient care. Like, you could develop a device that's solving a problem, but if it's not really making any, difference to patient outcomes, there is no point developing a device. Like, ultimately, what we're trying to do with medical devices is to affect patient outcomes in a positive manner. Make sure either help improve the quality of life or make things easier for a physician, which would ultimately translate into making care easier for the patient, or in general just help solve a public health problem. So it has to make a material difference to patient care. The next point is that the device has to be safe. We've talked about this in the previous slide, and I'm going to keep repeating this. It has to be safe. You cannot develop a medical device that is inherently dangerous and has no, and the risks of that device outweigh the benefits. Like, you shouldn't have a device that has a higher probability to kill someone than to help them. So you can't. In the extreme case, you may be able to make a justification to a regulator that such a device is indeed needed, but in general, that doesn't work. You have to have a device whose benefits outweigh its risks. Then that it is effective. Now, what I mean by effective is that it should work. It should do what it is intended to do. That a syringe should be able to inject fluids into the human body without causing any other issues. So it has to be effective. It should be able to do what it is intended to do. And these are very important issues. If you ever try to bring a device to market, let's say I'll talk about the FDA because that's been my experience. I've dealt with regulators from the FDA. Their main focus is on making sure that the device is safe and effective, that it does what it is intended to do. And until you can convince them of that, they're not going to let the device onto the market. So these are two critical issues. The next one is, of course, it has to be usable. I've talked about usability before. It's becoming a bigger and bigger issue with regulators. They want manufacturers to focus on usability of products. In fact, I can tell you about a case that happened in Canada a while back. There was I think it had to do with an infusion pump that was delivering cancer drugs to a patient. And what happened was the units on the packet of drugs and on the infusion pump were different. So the nurse made an error in doing the conversion of those units. And essentially what had to be delivered to the patient, I think over a course of 3 or 4 days, was delivered to the patient in within 3 or 4 hours. Now, as you know, chemotherapy drugs are basically poison. And if the dosage is not controlled properly, it can land up killing the patient. And that's exactly what happened. So that becomes an issue of usability. Like, you need to have the same units on the packet and the infusion pump, because nurses are dealing with emergencies, they're dealing with patients, they don't have the time to sit and do conversions. So that would be an example of a usability issue, and that usability issue requires consideration, and it needs to be solved. There was another, I can talk about another example where I think it was a machine that delivered radiation, and what was happening was that whenever the user tried to delete a value, it actually added zeros. So what ended up happening was that the amount of dosage, the radiation dosage being delivered to the patient was really, really high, much higher than that is recommended. Now that again becomes an issue of usability, which needs proper consideration, because it can land up causing harm to the patient. So, and again, like these issues, I will keep repeating these, and you will see this theme repeated throughout my slides, because at the end of the day, the device has to be safe, effective, and usable. We've talked about reliability, so I won't really, we all understand reliability. The device has to be reliable. It should work when it is needed. We'll meet regulatory requirements. Of course, at the end of the day, if you don't meet the specific regulatory requirements that are laid out for a particular device, you are not going to be able to sell that device on the market. If you try to sell it, you will be shut down by the regulators, and people have gone to jail for illegally selling medical devices. In fact, there was, if I remember correctly, in the US, there was a company that made plastic pipes, and 2 geniuses came up with this, and I mean, and I'm talking sarcastically, that these people, they somehow figured that they could sell these plastic pipes as catheters, and they began selling them as catheters, and they ended up going to jail. So you have to be able to meet the regulation, and of course there was no consideration of safety, effectiveness, and ultimately they did not meet any regulatory requirements. They violated laws, they violated regulations, and then ended up going to jail. And that is a risk that a lot of CEOs take. At the end of the day, if your device is out there causing harm to patients, people could land up going to jail. The CEO of the company could land up in jail. So you have to meet regulatory requirements, but that is a secondary issue. Like I've said, safety is the primary issue, and of course we have to meet the regulatory requirements. And then, of course, we've talked about this before, it has to turn a profit for the company. Again, a medical device that doesn't turn a profit for a company will not make it to the market. Even if it does make it to the market, it will disappear, because if it is not profitable, the company will not survive at the end of the day. Okay, any questions so far?
No, sir, there are no questions as of now, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, I
moving
have
on.
one question, Aparajit. This is
Sure.
Dr. Prasad. So, can you just highlight on the usability of the device? Like it was written that it should be easy to use. So, suppose if I come up with a device which is life saving or which can be life saving, but difficult to use for a patient. So, is it a good device for the market fit?
So it depends on who your target audience is. Are you intending the device to be used by a patient? And if that is true, if you require the patient to be able to use the device, it has to be easy to use. Like there is a specific standard that deals with devices that are made for home use, which essentially means that they will be used most likely by the patient. There is a very specific requirement to make it easy to use. Now, of course, easy to use is a very loose term here. I think someone just posted about IEC 62366.
Yes.
Yes, so yes, that is the standard for usability. You need to meet that standard. There's also a home use standard, which is 60601-1-11, which is a collateral standard to 60601-1. In that, there is a specific section that talks about usability. Usability. So based on what you said, like, you've intended devices, you want to make a device that is to be used by a patient rather than a physician. Then it essentially has to meet I think there is a requirement in there that someone with a grade 8 level of education or something like that should be able to use it without without undue burden. So that's something you'll have to focus on. Of course, 62366 I would say that it is a process standard. It can guide you as to how you can conduct usability testing, and it'll guide you as to how to conduct usability testing and the areas that you should focus on. But ultimately and fundamentally, it's an engineering problem that needs to be solved.
Okay.
So yeah, you have to first determine who your target audience is, and then you have to tailor the device to that audience.
Correct. So this has to be decided at the planning phase itself.
Absolutely. You have to decide in the beginning who's going to use this device. Yeah.
Yes. Got it. Thanks.
No problem. Any other questions? All right. So let's talk about design controls. Now, design control is essentially a philosophy, and of course, there are regulations around it. So design controls come from the US FDA, essentially. Of course, they call different things in different countries. But at the end of the day, like, the design control concept came from the FDA. And what it essentially is a system of checks and balances. Like, essentially, at the end of the day, what it's trying to achieve is that you know exactly what you're building, and what you're building will do what it is intended to do. That's what it is intended to ensure. Now, there are typically design controls. It's a stage-gated process. As you can see, I've talked about 5 stages here. There's no strict requirement to be doing doing design controls in this manner. You can do it as you could. At the end of you have to meet the requirements. That are set out by the FDA, or the requirements in the standard IEC 13485 ISO 13485-2016. So there is no strict method to practice design controls, as long and you can meet the requirements as intended. But I'm going to let me talk about these. Let me talk about this one method, and because it will give you more information as to what the requirements exactly are and what design controls intend to achieve. So as you can see, there are 5 stages described here. The very first one is the concept. So what problem are you trying to solve? So the concept phase is dedicated to that. You're identifying the problem you're trying to solve, gathering as much information from potential users as possible. Talking to physicians, talking to nurses, talking to other clinicians who will end up using the device, and getting their opinions on how, what is the problem that needs to be solved, and what are they looking for in a particular device. And then what that gives you is something called marketing requirement specification document. So essentially they're rough requirements, like, for example, the device should be light, the device should be easy to use. Like there'll be those requirements are not they're not specific. So like I said, easy to use, they should be able to detect blood flow in the carotid artery. That's a very general requirement. Now, in a later phase, we'll talk about how those convert into engineering requirements, but yeah, we'll come to that. The next stage, so in the concept phase, you're gathering all these requirements. Then in the concept phase itself, or you can even do it in the planning phase, based on the information that you've gathered, you can kind of envision the device that you want to make. And then based on that, you will do what is a risk analysis, making, determining what kind of risks would a potential device like this actually pose to the patient, to the user, and, do that risk analysis and maybe come up with mitigations that could help reduce the risk, the probability of the risk, or the severity of the harm that the risk could cause. So that can happen in the concept phase. In the planning phase, then you come to essentially planning out the product development process. You have a design and development plan as to the kind of engineering expertise you'll need to solve the problems. You will have a regulatory plan as to what markets are you planning to approach, what is the timeline for approaching those markets, what will you need to do if it's what would the potential classification of that device be in a particular market. So it could be a class 2 device in the US, it could be a class 3 in Canada, and that's totally possible because, for example, the device that we're developing at Flowsonics is a class 2 medical device in the US, and a class 3 medical device in Canada, and a class 2A medical device in Europe. So it is quite possible that it has different classifications and may have to meet different requirements in different jurisdictions. So you plan for that. You have a regulatory plan, and you put everything into that regulatory plan. So the planning phase is essentially laying out the timeline, the goals, and all these things. And then what happens is you move on to the design phase. The design phase is where you take the marketing requirements that we had in the concept phase, and you take those requirements and you convert them into product requirements. Now, the product requirements are what are engineering, essentially specific engineering requirements. For example, if the marketing requirement was the device has to be light, you specify here what light means. Does it mean 10 grams? Does it mean 100 kilos? So based on the context, a device could be light at 100 kgs and it could be light at 10 grams. So based on the context or any intended use, you would define what that number is or what that specification is. So if let's say, for example, Flowsonics is developing a blood flow detector in the carotid artery, we need to specify how deep the carotid, what is the depth at which the carotid artery lies, so that if you're using ultrasound, how deep would the ultrasound have to penetrate to be able to get that signal. So that happens in the design phase. Now, another thing that happens in the design phase is those product requirements get converted into design outputs. So design outputs will be essentially drawings and your drawings, CAD drawings and electrical specifications and PCB designs. All those things within the design phase. Essentially, what you start doing is you start creating the device. Again, this is still not a commercial medical device. It's still in what you would call a prototype phase. You still haven't reached the point where the device can be sold. You're you start building the device. Then in the next phase, which is verification and validation, in verification, you make sure that all the product requirements that you had set out originally, that you meet all those requirements, and the device meets all the device is meeting all those requirements. So essentially, you've built the correct thing. And then we talk about validation, which is essentially making sure that the device is doing what it's intended to do. So verification, making sure that you built what is correct, and validation, making sure that the device is doing what it's intended to do. So usually verification is done in a lab or in your office, where you test, you measure things, you do electrical measurements and such to make sure that the product requirements, the specific engineering requirements that you have set out, you meet those. But when you move on to validation, in most cases, validation is done in the clinic. You can do a clinical trial, you can do a clinical study, you can do a usability evaluation. In some cases, the usability evaluation is enough, and that then covers validation. And then finally, you come to design transfer, where the device is ready. One thing that I missed in all of this is, during this entire development process, it's very important to know exactly what standards and regulatory requirements. Sorry, I just saw a question here. Let me just. How to do design file for previously developed devices? So that is a very broad question. Essentially, what you would need to do is backfill all the documentation. You would need to backfill all the documentation and make sure that it will pass all the testing that it needs to pass. Yeah, that's all I can say here. You would have to backfill everything. My work as a consultant was doing that. A lot of companies, you would have clients who would come in and say, you know what, we have this device, it's already developed, but we don't have any of the documentation. So then our job was to basically write up all the documentation, and of course, during that process, you would find the n number of things that they've missed. So then they would have to go back and either redesign something or modify something so that it can pass 60601-1 testing, or any meet specific standards or meet specific requirements. So it is a difficult process, of course, because you are backfilling everything, but it is not impossible. It can be done. Consultants, companies do it every day. So yeah, does that answer your question? Mariappan, I think. Okay, I didn't hear anything from Mariappan, so I'm going to move on. Okay, so yeah, ultimately, it's important to know what you're building and verify that you built what was intended, and that it performs as intended. Now, a very important part of design control is traceability. So traceability means being able to trace where a specific requirement came from, what product requirement matches up to which marketing specification, and then which design output matches up to which product requirement specification, and then which verification or test is verifying the fact that you met the product requirement, and then which validation test essentially verifies that you've met or validates that you've met a marketing requirement. This is a broader topic, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but please feel free to email questions to me after the session. But essentially, what you do is you have marketing requirements that become that get converted into product requirements. The product requirements need verification, and then validation. Validation basically validates the fact that a particular marketing requirement has been met. So traceability is fundamental, and traceability is not only fundamental in product development, but in quality assurance. You need to know where a particular part came from. So Aslam has a question: is design controls applicable to all regulations? Example, I would say generally yes, but it depends on the class of device. There are some cases where you can exclude design controls, but in most cases where the device is, has some sort of risk, you would need to practice design controls. So there are exceptions to design controls, of course, but that's on a case-by-case basis. Depends on the classification and how a regulator looks at the risk of a particular device. So yeah, in general, the answer to that question is yes, but you need to be specific as to what particular technology or device you're talking about, and then you need to look up the requirements of a particular regulator with regards to that technology, so that you can determine whether design controls are in fact applicable or not. Does that answer your question, Aslam? Okay. So yes, as I was saying, traceability is fundamental, not only in product development, but also in quality assurance. You need to know where a part came from, so that if there is ever a failure in the field, you should know who built that device, where did the parts come from, was there an issue with a specific batch of parts, and were those parts used in a build, so that you can essentially get to the root of the problem and fix it. Quality management. I think there's only 13 minutes left, so I'm going to try and rush through the remaining slides. Quality management. The quality management system is essentially is a set of processes that guide how you do things in a company. So essentially, it's laying down, putting on paper exactly how something needs to be done, and those procedures are called standard operating procedures. So if let's say, for example, you need to purchase a part from a supplier, then there will be a purchasing process, and as long as you follow the process, you should be able to complete the purchase without any issues. And if there are deviations, then you would need to justify why you deviated, and essentially that's what it is. It is putting on paper exactly what the process is, so that there is traceability. You can, if there is a problem down the line, let's say, for example, if you're working in a startup, you may just, someone might ask you to purchase something from Amazon, and then you forget about it. And then let's say there was an issue with that particular part, and now no one knows where the part came from because no one wrote it down. There was no process. But if you had a process in place, you would essentially put in a request to someone who would approve the request, and then someone would place the order, would check that the correct part was actually received, and then you would have traceability there. You would know who the part came from, when did it arrive in a damaged state or not. So processes are very important to maintain consistency, and that's essentially what a quality management system is trying to do. Design controls give you a design that is repeatably manufacturable. Quality management ensures that that you can ensure that that repeatability is maintained. So that's essentially what quality management system does. It ensures that the repeatability is maintained when you're manufacturing a product. Okay, I guess that's not a question. It's just Satyen explaining something to everyone. Thank you for that, Satyen. Next, we come to some development standards and tools. There are two types of standards, one which are technical and have specific requirements that you would need to meet, for example, 60601-1. And there's another type called process standards, which essentially define a process that you can follow to be able to consistently produce safe and effective products. So, for example, the quality systems standard ISO 13485, risk management standard 14971, the human factors evaluation standard 62366, software lifecycle 62304, all, and the clinical trial management standard ISO 14155. They're all process standards. and they essentially tell you what documentation you need, what should your plan include, what should your report include, how should you conduct a particular evaluation. So they're process standards. They're not, you can't really claim compliance to them. All you can really say is, so I think there is CHPL research that just asked, can you clarify whether it's essential to obtain 13485 from notified bodies listed by CDSO in India? I think that's a very broad question. You need to be specific as to what you're manufacturing, what you're trying to sell. So if you could provide some specifics, then maybe able to answer the question. And with regards to the CDSO, I'm not CDSCO. I'm not that sure because I don't deal with that with the Indian jurisdiction. My specialty is more the US, Canada, and Europe. So I can answer for that. If someone else has more expertise in that area, please feel free to answer that question. But in general, I would say if you're making a medical device, most likely yes. Sorry. So yeah, they're process standards, and then there are standards such as IC 60601-1, which is general, which is the general safety, basic safety and essential performance standard, where there are specific technical requirements that you need to meet. So you would need to take it to a third-party test lab and get it tested. Same thing with biocompatibility, ISO 10993. There are 12 standards, in fact. 10993-1 is the general, and then there are 12 actually 18, if I'm correct. I may be wrong on the number here, but yeah, up to 18 standards that come under 10993, which have specific tests that you may need to run. For example, different tests of cytotoxicity, sensitization, irritation, systemic toxicity, mutagenicity, like a whole bunch. And then within 60601-1, there's the general standard and their particular standards for specific technologies. For example, X-rays will have their own standard. I'll talk more about standards tomorrow at the same time. So I'll expand on this tomorrow, but it would suffice to know today that there are process standards and there are technical standards, and both serve different purpose. Of course, there is a very important tool that is provided by regulators. I mean, essentially, it's one regulator that's really good about it. The US FDA is guidance documents. I would recommend that everyone go and read the design control guidance by the FDA, because essentially every other regulator in the world, except maybe, and even Europe, like they all follow design controls in one form or another. And that guidance was written back in 1997. So I would recommend it's definitely, please go and read it. It is very informative about the product development process, and it'll tell you what the fundamental principles of product development are. Anyways, so there are also specific guidance from the FDA about biocompatibility and ultrasound safety and what specific requirements ultrasound devices need to meet. Very recently, when COVID started, the FDA came out with a guidance on what specific requirements ventilators would need to meet. So there's a lot of good information from the FDA. There is some guidance from Health Canada. The MDR, which is Europe, they're still coming out with guidances. So there's the MDCG, the NBOG. These bodies are coming out with guidances which can help you either comply with specific requirements, or how to write a technical file. So there's a lot of good information out there. I would recommend look up guidance documents, read them. They're the best tool that you have to succeed in regulatory affairs and quality assurance. And then, of course, there are basically standards for everything. It is also possible that there may be no standard. So there's a question here. Are you referring to 21 CFR Part 820? If you're talking about quality systems, yes, that is that it's also referred to as the QSR, the quality systems regulations. So yes, in terms of quality management and design controls, yes, I am referring to FTA 21 CFR Part 820. And feel free to go and read those regulations. They've been written. They've been written in such a way that they're anyone can understand them. I wouldn't recommend going and reading laws because they're written by lawyers, so they're difficult to understand. But regulations, at least in the US, are easy to understand. So I would recommend going and reading them. They're easy to understand, so you will be able to grasp exactly what they're trying to say. All right, I have 4 minutes left. So I think I've pretty much covered a lot about. I've maybe briefly introduced you to the regulatory requirements by the FDA. Of course, 21 CFR Part 820. You need to comply with that in order to be able to sell a medical device in the US. Of course, the FDA will not audit you. Okay, I'm not going to go into specifics of whether the FDA is going to either going to or not going to audit you, because it depends on the class of device that you're manufacturing and the risk of the device. So for example, the FDA will most definitely audit someone who's manufacturing a PMA level class 3 device like a pacemaker before they're able to put the device on the market. But if you are manufacturing a much lower risk device such as an ultrasound device, you can essentially put your device on the market without complying with 21 CFR Part 820, but at some point you will, not at some point, but within 2 years, you need essentially, if you're manufacturing a low-risk device, the FDA is not going to come and audit you in the next 2 years. They say they can, but they're not going to do that. So you have 2 years to implement a quality system. Although it is not recommended to do that, when you're submitting a 510K, make sure that you have at least a basic quality management system in place. Do not mess with the FDA. They will shut you down and they will prosecute you. Do not mess with any regulator, in fact, whether it's the CDSCO, the FDA, or even notified bodies. Even though notified bodies don't they don't have any enforcement powers, but they have powers in the sense that they can get competent authorities or regulators to shut you down. So do not mess with them. Health Canada, then I'm not really going to cover Canada. I'm going to skip over that because I don't have much time left. But essentially, requirements in Canada are very similar. Like they've taken something from the US, they've taken something from the old MDD, and these even Health Canada, their regulations are evolving as technology progresses. But essentially, so they've taken some from the FDA, some from the MDD. And then there's, of course, the EU MDR, which is the new big behemoth that is out there. They've essentially gone from a directive to a regulation. So a directive, the difference between a directive and a regulation is that the directive was guidance, basically, for countries in the European Union on how they should regulate medical devices, whereas regulations are specific regulations that need to be followed in order to be able to put your device on the European market. So that's the UMD. Yeah, there are other jurisdictions which have specific requirements. I'm sure the Indian, the CDSCO has specific requirements that you need to meet. I will not be able to expand on what those are because I'm not too familiar and I don't want to give you any wrong information. But so that kind of sums up the specific regulatory requirements. You need to meet them, and that's how you will be able to sell your medical device in that specific jurisdiction. So I would say that kind of that wraps up what I had to say today. Are there any questions? I'm sorry I had to rush towards the end because I kind of got carried away in the beginning. But please feel free to ask questions. I'm here if you have questions.
Sir, I had a question like,
Yeah.
if we get a second-hand machine from some other country abroad into our country, so are there any specific we have to go to the regulatory bodies again for them to approve the machine, or we can get them directly, sir?
It depends on whether that machine is approved in your country or not. So if the machine is already approved, then you most likely will not need to go to the regulators. But if it's an unapproved machine, then yes. Also, it depends on whether you're getting it in for research or for clinical use. For clinical use, 100% you have to go to the regulator if it's an unapproved machine. But if you're getting it in for research, there are exceptions. The FDA has exceptions. There are exceptions in Canada. I'm sure there are exceptions in India. So one, you need to determine what use are you getting that machine in for, whether the device is already approved or not. And once you answer those questions, it should be clear whether you need to go to the regulator or not. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Any other questions? Thank you, Satin. It's very kind of you, and well, that's amazing to know that you've headed Indian operations of the CSA. But I'm going to be honest, that my experience with the CSA in Canada hasn't been great, but I think they're a good, they do a good job, overall. What about customized machines developed in-house? Like I said, depends. Again, there are exceptional cases where a customized machine maybe it depends on what kind of customized machine you're talking about. Let's say, for example, if you developed an implant that is customized to the patient, there are new regulations in each jurisdiction about those about such devices. And by they still need to meet requirements. They may not meet to, actually, yes, they still need to meet requirements. And again, this is a very general question. I would need to know more specifics to answer that question accurately, because developed in-house can mean a lot of things. It could mean that it meets specific regulatory requirements. It may not meet. Yeah, so that's a very broad question. But in general, I would say most likely you would still need to go to a regulator. Again, if it is a high-risk device, so even a moderate risk device, you would need to go to a regulator. At the end of the day, the best thing to do is talk to the regulator if you're unsure. But again, at the same time, do not approach the regulator if that problem has already been solved before. If someone else is doing the same thing, do not approach the regulator. Try and find out how they're doing it, unless you're convinced that what they're doing is illegal, in which case you should go to the regulator. But ultimately, the regulators are the sure. Let me. And for Lalit, please also specify which jurisdiction you're talking about, because then I would need to focus on that jurisdiction to be able to answer that question accurately. Right. Any other questions? All right. If there are no other questions, that's about it from my side. And I will be doing another presentation tomorrow at the same time about international standards and third-party testing. That might be a little more fun. It's more engineering oriented than this. This is, of course, quality management systems and regulatory affairs, always a dry topic. I can't make it lightly. I'm sorry.
I would like to thank you, sir, now for giving us such a good an overview about the requirements. And now I would like to hand over the platform to Bhargavi ma'am now.
Thank you, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. Thank you, everyone, for having me.
Bhargavi ma'am, sir is left. Oh,
Sure, ma'am.
Hello.
Thank you so much,
okay.
everyone. Bye-bye.
I think somebody is want to ask something, ma'am.
Oh, sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Hi, Tejas here. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah. I had a question. I don't know how it would be. I'm say in the case of development of medical devices. See, when we, I wanted to ask, are there any challenges with respect to the fact, what do you call the factors like the accuracy, stress, strain when we test a medical device, and initially when we manufacture them on a very small scale, and then when we see the design are matching, and then we scale up them accordingly to a large scale basically. So what are the challenges faced during this type of thing, development of medical
So
devices?
I think that's a very great question, and scaling is a big issue. And in fact, the company I'm working for is going through that process. So I
Mhm.
think with regards to scaling manufacturing, the question becomes like one, what are your projected sales? Now,
Mhm.
I say that because you need to be able to determine how much investment you can put into, let's say, automation, or whether you're going to be using a lot of manual processes. And when you're in that medium volume kind of place,
Yeah.
it's very difficult because you're not able to automate a lot of processes which could be automated because you don't have the capital to do that. But at
Mhm.
the same time, you need to keep using manual processes in order to be able to sell the device. So I think it also boils down to what the specifics are of the technology. But in terms of testing, I think it should be pretty straightforward. But in terms of making sure that you're able to manufacture a specific volume, I think that's more of a challenge because it's very difficult in the beginning to determine how much